Many of us spend a long time trying to find these amazing photos of beautiful, interesting, unique subjects in order to sit down to draw. But the fact of the matter is that we can build up essential drawing skills using everyday common objects that we have around us. In today's video, I'm going to be sharing my sketching process organized into phases for 5 different leaf studies. This is going to be a great opportunity to practice your block-in, to practice recreating accurate shapes freehand, and also to practice developing a nice range of values to develop a sense of depth and dimension on the page. These are also organic objects, so we get to practice bringing in imperfection, irregularity, and lots of variety so that we can arrive at a natural look. Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Erica and I'm a traditional media artist working with a variety of mediums. And here on YouTube, I share videos on sketching, watercolor, developing a strong artist mindset for sustained success. And also from time to time, I share videos on art business. I share new videos every single week. So if that sounds interesting to you, make sure to click on that subscribe button. It's completely free. It means a lot to me and it does a lot to help ensure that I can keep creating these videos to share on here. All right, with all that said, let's jump in. For these studies, I'm using Mars Lumograph black pencils from Staedtler. These are different from traditional graphite pencils because they have carbon in their cores. And because they are carbon-based, this will allow me to create blacks in my darkest areas, and also the outcome will be matte, as opposed to when we're using regular graphite pencils, we can only get so dark. We can achieve very dark grays, but not blacks. And also with traditional pencils, the outcome looks shinier. It has a sheen to it. It is reflective. There are artists who use both types of pencils in their work and combine the strengths of both mediums to create beautiful pieces with a lot of depth to them. I bought these pencils a while back and I just wanted to experiment with them. And I'm using the exact same method and techniques that I would use if I were using traditional graphite pencils. I brought in 3 different pencil grades, an HB, a 4B, and an 8B. And I made my way gradually toward the darker values and the softer pencil grades. I have a video where I explain all about different drawing pencil grades and how they can come in handy throughout the drawing or sketching process. I'll make sure to link to it in the recommended resources below in case you haven't checked it out. All right, so I'm walking you through my 6-phase process, and I'm going to be using this process for all of these leaves. So first I'm getting started with my HB pencil. The HB pencil is going to help me keep my drawing nice and light and relatively clean so that I can continue erasing mistakes and refining as I go. Phase number 1 is the block-in phase. In this phase, I'm creating a very blocky, oversimplified shape, which is kind of an envelope for the entire leaf. I am oversimplifying the shape of the leaf, ignoring curves and things like that, and mostly thinking of the overall proportion of the object, height versus width, and trying to get that in at least similar to what I'm observing. Because these are organic objects, it doesn't matter if my proportions aren't exactly the same as those in the photo, but it is good to challenge ourselves so that we can continue building up our visual measuring skills and our ability to capture more challenging shapes freehand. In phase number 2, I draw my leaf shape inside of my initial block-in. And it is helpful in this phase to also draw at least the major veins because of how those veins extend out and into the different parts of this leaf shape. Also, adding in that central vein, especially near the beginning of the process, can help you develop that sense of symmetry. It's not perfect symmetry, but it does help you create a sense of balance left to right when you're drawing leaves so that the overall shape doesn't seem lopsided. At this point, I also erased that initial oversimplified block-in that I started with. Then I move on to phase 3, and this is where I refine my shape. So if I want to bring out the shape a little bit more here and there, or bring it in, or add more imperfection and irregularities along those edges to make this look even more natural, I go ahead and do that. I can also add in smaller veins that I haven't added in. When it comes to veins, I see them as the primary central vein, the secondary veins that are coming out, which are also pretty large, and then we have the smallest, more tertiary veins. And it is important to observe the pattern of those veins and in what direction they are coming out and how they are tapering and how some are more subtle than others, because this variety is important if we want this leaf to look natural. And we're going to be expanding on that variety as we go. All right, and once I'm done with that, it's time to move on to phase 4, and this is where we start developing our shading or our values. So far, I've only been using my HB pencil, and this first layering of material on my paper is going to be done with my HB pencil, and I'm going to be building on this. First, I develop a light gray layer over the entire leaf using the side of the tip of my pencil to cover everything up in a uniform way. And then I continue doing more layering, but only in darker areas that I'm wanting to develop throughout the leaf, allowing the previous lighter gray layer to shine through in lighter value areas that I want to keep protected. Essentially, I'm going to be layering on more material and covering up more paper in darker value areas and leaving more of that white paper shining through in lighter value areas, which are also very important to have. You can see how I'm continuing to use the side of the tip of my pencil as I am filling in sections, and I'm switching to more of an extended tripod grip when I'm adding in lines and marks or wanting to create a little bit more definition along some edges, wherever I need more control. Here I'm adding in more of those smallest tertiary veins, if you will. I had added in a few before, but they weren't really visible after doing my layering. Once I've developed a nice range of gray values and I also have all of the veins that I want to include, it is time for phase 5, and for this, I switch on over to my next pencil grade, which is my 4B pencil. And with this pencil, I'm only doing layering in darker areas that I'm wanting to develop, making sure that I'm not doing any layering with this pencil in lighter value areas that I want to keep protected. It's all about developing that wide range of values, and right now we're expanding into those darkest darks. For my shading, I'm not going super closely by what I'm seeing in the reference photo. More so, I'm prioritizing developing lighter areas, mid-tone areas, and darker areas, and also staying away from the look of stark looking outlines, marks, and things like that that can take away from the realism. As I start developing my darker areas, I make sure to release any pressure that I'm exerting as I make my way into the lighter areas. This creates softer, more gradual transitions between your values. Once I've expanded my range of values a little bit more with my middle pencil, which is the 4B, I switch on over to my last pencil, which is the 8B, and with this one, I'm focusing on doing my layering only in those smallest, darkest areas that I want to push the contrast in. I'm also adding in little marks and imperfections throughout the leaf, similar to what I'm observing in the photo. I made sure to create a nice variety in line weights throughout my veins because I knew that this was important for the realism. You can see how some sections of my veins look lighter and other sections look darker. I did the same thing along the edges of the leaf. You can see how some edges are a little bit darker and others are lighter, almost merging with the white in the background. These would be referred to as lost edges. And at no point throughout this process, not even in this last phase where I'm going in to push the darkest values, am I going in and pressing hard or doing burnishing or that kind of technique. That is the beauty of bringing in multiple pencil grades, is that you don't have to press down or burnish in order to create darker looking areas. All right, let's move on to leaf study number 2. And this looks more like a maple leaf shape, but I get started with the first phase, which is the blocking phase. Here you can see me once again simplifying the shape of the leaf into more of a blocky, geometric-y looking shape. For this particular leaf, I do make my initial block and shape a little bit closer to what I'm observing in the reference photo. More angle changes, I guess you could say, when compared to the first one. This just has to do with the actual shape of the leaf. You can decide how much to simplify when you're creating that block in on a case-by-case scenario. Once my initial blocking is in, I immediately draw the main veins. They are so important for this type of leaf, and I feel that having those in will help me create my actual leaf shape more effectively. And then I take my time drawing that leaf shape using my initial block-in shape as guide. I've always found drawing this kind of leaf challenging because of the symmetry involved, and its shape is similar to a star in that the different pointy sections start changing in orientation as you make your way down. The upper point at the top is going up, but then the pointy sections to the left and to the right, they are changing in angle. They are pointing a little bit more toward the left and toward the right as you make your way down toward the bottom of the leaf, if that makes sense. And it's hard for me to capture that while maintaining some level of symmetry and trying to keep the proportions somewhat similar to what I see in the photo when it comes to the height and the width. And this is part of the reason why I make my initial block and shape a little bit more similar to what I see in the photo from the beginning, so that the guide can be a little bit more specific as I'm drawing the shape. Of course, there's always going to be some amount of imperfection and asymmetry along that leaf shape, which I want to make sure to capture as well, but I don't want the left and right sides of this shape to look so different that the shape once again looks lopsided or something like that. Finishing up with my shape, adding in those final smaller veins here while observing their pattern and length and direction in that reference photo. And then I do some quick refining before moving on to my shading. The refinement phase is pretty quick on this one because I really took my time drawing that shape in phase number 2. Once the refinement phase is done, it is time to move on to my shading phases. So I first start with that initial light gray uniform layer all throughout the leaf, still using my HB pencil. With that initial light uniform layer in, I continue using the same pencil to layer on more material in mid-tone and darker areas that I'm going to be developing more in the next layers. When it comes to this leaf, I am going a little bit more by what I see in the reference in terms of value changes. The leaf in the previous reference photo looked pretty light all throughout, except for a couple of areas here and there. So if I try to replicate that, that would likely lead to flat looking results. So for that one, I brought in my artistic license to develop a wider range of values than what I actually saw in the reference photo. But in this leaf, I do see very dark areas, midtones, and very light areas. So I can go more closely by the value relationships that I see in the reference. This said, I'm never trying to copy the reference photo exactly as is, but I am using the reference photo to help me remember important characteristics and little nuances that I might have otherwise forgotten. I do go over certain vein sections, especially because some of them, especially the thinnest, smallest ones, are disappearing as I am layering on more material on the page. Once I have at least a couple of light gray values in, I switch on over to my 4B pencil and I do more layering in darker midtone areas and darkest dark areas that I'm wanting to push the contrast in more. Making sure that I am releasing any pressure that I'm exerting as I make my way into lighter value sections so that I can create gradual transitions. I'm also starting to add in more imperfections with this pencil grade, a bit of a mottled look here and there, and you're going to notice how I start going over certain sections of my veins to darken only certain sections, make them look a little bit thicker and darker, and also I do the same along some of the edges of my leaf. I do more layering along certain sections in the outer edges and leave other sections lighter, creating more variety, a more natural look, and avoiding the look of outlines. And then it's finally time to switch on over to my last pencil, which is my 8B, my softest pencil grade. With this one, I'm just jumping around the entire leaf, seeing the leaf as a whole and making sure that I've developed a nice range of values all throughout the leaf, a nice sense of variety, and really only layering on more material in sections that are those darkest darks. As a rule of thumb, the darker and softer I get with my pencil grades, the smaller the shapes that I create are, and the more mindful I have to be of only using these softer pencil grades in areas where I want a darker look. If I use these softer pencil grades in lighter areas, I can really darken everything and make everything flat and heavy. And then it was time to move on to my third leaf, and I did my best to choose leaves that were quite different in terms of shape so that I can challenge myself in this area. So I started with that oversimplified shape, the blockin, and right now I am working on the leaf shape inside of that blockin, using that initial shape as guide. Sometimes when I'm actually drawing my leaf or whatever it is, I end up going a little bit past my initial shape, or I end up not reaching that initial shape, and that is totally fine because the objective with that initial block-in is just to lay down a shape that can help us visualize what is coming up next. Nothing is set in stone in the block-in, it's just a guide to help you with what's coming up next. This leaf is also challenging because it has that same shape to it like the previous one, where the different sections are changing an angle as you're making your way down along the left and along the right sides. But this one does have smoother curves to it and fewer irregular pointy shapes sticking out of these different sections. For this one, I drew that central vein, almost like a middle vertical line, dividing this leaf into left and right halves pretty soon into this process because it would help me create a better, more symmetrical shape. And this right here would be my refinement phase, where I'm also adding in those secondary veins. Spending time with this outline drawing and making sure that I like it before moving on to my shading is very important. Once I'm happy with my leaf shape and I've done some refining, it's time to move on to my shading process. So still using my HB pencil, I first create that light gray uniform layer all throughout the leaf. And then I do some layering in mid-tone and darker areas that I'm going to be developing darker values in. For this one, I also went more by what I saw in the photo, where lighter values are around the veins. And then I see a deeper red value as I'm moving outward and toward the edges of the leaf. You can go over your veins if you feel that they have disappeared as you have continued with your layering, but make sure to keep them relatively subtle, not super stark, because you will be developing darker values in them later. Once I have a couple of light gray values developed, it's time to switch to my 4B pencil. And with this one, I do layering in darker midtones and darkest dark areas that I want to push more, allowing the previous layers to shine through in lighter value areas. I don't want to cover those up and get rid of my lighter values that I very much need. With this pencil, I go over certain sections of my veins, certain sections of the edges of the leaf shape, and you can also go in to add in little imperfections, little mottled effects throughout the leaf as well. And then I switched onto my last pencil, which is my 8B pencil. And with this one, I'm only going over smaller sections, looking at the leaf as a whole and making sure that I'm happy with the range of values that I've developed, as well as the variety in line weights in my veins and gradual transitions between my values. Moving on to leaf, or maybe I should say set of leaves, number 4. And with this one, I have 3 separate leaves that are all attached to one same stem. And because I have 3 separate leaves, I approach this one in a slightly different way because I create 3 separate block-ins for each leaf. Instead of going in and right away trying to create a perfect looking shape with smooth curves for each leaf, I bring together a series of straight lines, creating that blockier shape, just paying attention to the major angle changes. And once those shapes look good to me, I then go ahead and refine those shapes and turn those more angular, blocky looking shapes into smoother curves. I do create that central vein for each leaf very soon into the process, but I would say that even though we do have 3 leaves, To draw in this one, the leaf shapes in and of themselves are way simpler than the ones that we worked on previously. Once I'm happy with my outline drawing, I get started with the shading process, still using my HB pencil and creating that initial light uniform gray layer before building on top. Once again, we have a reference photo where we have very light values all throughout the leaf. So I have to bring in my artistic license to develop a wider range of values than what I actually see if I'm wanting to arrive at more realistic results that have dimension and depth to them. There is an interesting difference between these leaves that I'm sketching right now and the ones that I worked on before. The veins in these leaves look lighter than the color around them, whereas in the previous leaves, the veins were darker than the colors around them. So for these, as I'm working on my layering, I am leaving a little section, especially in that middle vein. I'm leaving a little section with a very light gray, and I'm building darker grays to the left and right of that middle lighter section. This will create a lighter look in the middle vein. But the shading process is exactly the same. I'm focusing on developing that range of values, having lighter areas, mid-tone areas, and darkest areas, and making my way toward my softer pencil grade. At the end of this process, you're going to see me go in with both my kneadable eraser to do some tapping over certain sections that I feel have gotten a little bit too dark. And I'm also going to be bringing in my Mono Zero eraser, which is a very fine eraser that you can use to pull up highlights to make those central veins even lighter. And finally, we're moving on to the very last leaf, and we have a very different shape here. This one has a lot more curves to it, and it doesn't have distinct sections. It's just like one big shape. I start with my block-in phase, where I'm bringing together a series of straight lines, paying attention to the major angle changes taking place in the photo there. Once my block-in is looking okay in terms of general shapes and proportions, I create my actual leaf shape inside of that using the block-in as a guide. And as I am actually drawing my leaf shape, I'm bringing in more of those smaller curves that I see in the reference photo so that I can have a similar irregularity along that shape. The veins are challenging in this one because since the leaf is not broken up into distinctive sections and it just has softer asymmetrical curves, there is not too much symmetry in those veins either. So I just try to get them in to the best of my abilities, trying to pay attention to the pattern that I see in the reference, their angle, and their length. Then I start with my shading, always starting with my HB pencil for those initial layers. And once I have developed somewhat of a range of light gray values, I move on to my 4B, expand that range of values, and then finally I go in with my 8B, focusing on layering only in the darkest sections that I'm looking to push more. Along the way, I make sure to develop a nice line weight variation in those veins as well with my different pencils, making sure that certain sections look darker and thicker and others look lighter and thinner. And I am careful with this one because in the photo, there is a very distinctive darker value along the upper outer edge of this leaf shape. And I don't want to end up with an outliney look. And for me, the trick is just to see those as abstract irregular shapes, create soft transitions between my darker values and my lighter values by releasing that pressure as I make my way in. And also making sure that I'm not going in with a very dark value all throughout my upper edge. Yes, I want the outer edges to be darker than the values inside of the leaf, but there can be a variety in values in the outer edge. The trick is developing a variety of darker values along those edges. It helps to make some of those dark shapes wider and others more narrow, make some lighter and others darker. Keep that variety. And that is it for this leaf sketching tutorial. I really hope that by sharing my process for all 5 leaves, you can see how the same method works for all of them. I think it's important to go in with a strategy and eventually arrive at a method that works for you and the results that you personally enjoy, because then it's just going to be a matter of following that process again and again. And of course, not everything is going to be exactly the same. It's going to vary a little bit depending on the specific subject on hand. But as long as you have those phases to keep coming back to and those important principles in mind to help you arrive at the results that you personally enjoy, the process will be way easier and you'll likely arrive at better results. If you have any comments or questions, go ahead and leave them in the comments below. I always love hearing from you and I'm always happy to help. And thank you so very much for joining me on this one. I wish you a wonderful rest of your day. Enjoy your art practice and see you very, very soon.